So the final numbers aren't in yet, but according to a report in the New York Times, Bernie Sanders is once again dominating fundraising, this time in the fourth quarter. And again, this is with no private fundraisers, no bundlers, no PACs, just individual contributions, mostly small individual contributions. So how did the New York Times write their headline? Here you go. Biden rebounds, Warren slows, Sanders rolls. The latest on the 2020 money race. An early look at fourth quarter fundraising shows Joseph R. Biden Jr. bouncing back, Elizabeth Warren lagging her previous benchmark, and Bernie Sanders continuing to haul in cash. Now, this headline at least mentions Bernie Sanders. Initially, the first headline that the New York Times put out didn't even put Bernie Sanders in the headline. Now, imagine Joe Biden raised the most money by far out of anybody in the race, or Pete Buttigieg, or Elizabeth Warren. They would be in the headline. Bernie Sanders raises the most, not mentioned in the headline until there's a backlash, and then they put him in the headline, and even when he's in the headline, it's not clear that he is the first in fundraising. So the reason why the headlines are so important is because that's how most people absorb information. Most people don't read the stories. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. So, and even if you do read the story, they don't mention Bernie's numbers until the fourth paragraph. Again, this is the guy leading in fundraising. So here's what they say. Mr. Sanders is expected to remain a financial pace setter in the 2020 contest. He has about 1.6 million individual donations this quarter alone and is nearing a goal of 5 million total contributions. With an average donation of $18 for the year and slightly less than that now, the numbers suggest he has already raised about 26 million in the fourth quarter, more than any Democratic candidate has raised in any quarter this year. So you have far and away the candidate who has raised the most and has done it with only individual contributors. Not important enough to put in the headline. So look, there was one day after Christmas, I did a story on how it was the New York Times and Politico had a couple objective pieces on the Bernie Sanders campaign. I almost said positive, but it's not really. I mean, it's positive, yes, but that's because the objective fact that Bernie Sanders is doing so well and has so much support is positive. But they just finally covered him objectively, saying Bernie Sanders actually has a great shot at winning the nomination. So that was the day after Christmas, and cable news covered it and made it a big story. But now it appears they're back to the Bernie blackout. So you have just a few days later, all of a sudden, Bernie Sanders, the fact that he's raising the most out of anybody in the race with individual contributors, not the biggest story here, according to the New York Times. But so the final numbers for the fourth quarter aren't in yet. But based on the estimates that the New York Times put together, Bernie Sanders, as you saw there, has 26 million for the fourth quarter, up from 25.3 million in the third quarter. Buttigieg has roughly 21 million, slightly up from 19.1 million in the third quarter. Warren is, they say she's aiming for 20 million, which is down from her 24.6 million in the third quarter. And Biden has raised about 21.5 million, which is up from 15 million in quarter three, which is a big jump for him. But again, he's now also embracing, PAC money. So, when it comes to super PACs, that money is not in this figure here, but it helps to, keep Biden in the race, essentially. You have a candidate here in Joe Biden who somehow is still in first. I have to admit, a lot of us, people like me, other progressives, thought that Biden would be a lot lower right now in the list of people leading the 2020 race. But he's still in first. He's maintaining. And now that he's embracing a super PAC, that's only going to continue to help him and really keep him in this race, as super PACs spend tons of money, tons of dark money on things like campaign ads that the Joe Biden campaign doesn't have to spend the money on themselves. So compare that to a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who has no super PAC, again, only relying on individual contributions. Now, again, because of that, there's not really a proper apples to apples comparison here when it comes to Biden, Buttigieg, and comparing that to Sanders and Warren. Biden and Buttigieg also rely heavily on bundlers, which again Sanders does not use. So this from the New York Times. Both Mr. Biden and Mr. Buttigieg recently did disclose their bundlers, with Mr. Buttigieg sharing the names of more than 100 people or couples who had gathered at least $25,000, and Mr. Biden disclosing more than 200. Mr. Biden appeared to time his release to minimize attention, revealing the names of his top fundraisers late on the Friday evening after Christmas. So, I mean, Joe Biden, you have him here essentially trying to hide how he raises money, because bundlers take lots of money from wealthy private donors, and that's where they get the money from. They bundle it and they give it to the campaigns. So Biden is hiding how he's raising his money. Meanwhile, you have Bernie Sanders here on Twitter saying we're almost at 5 million individual contributions, but we're not quite there yet. Can you chip in before midnight tomorrow and prove our critics wrong? So nobody in the race is anywhere near 5 million individual contributions. Bernie Sanders is nearing that number. Again, this is a headline-worthy story, but most of the mainstream press, because they ignore Bernie Sanders, aren't going to make this a headline. But it shows you far and away, Bernie Sanders has the most grassroots support, the most on-the-ground support, the most support from actual people that care about the issues, that are actually affected, impacted by politics. That's where Bernie's support comes from. Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, wealthy donors, bundlers, that's where their support comes from. And again, I've said this in the past, but it needs to be repeated. Even if you go into a private fundraiser with wealthy donors, with the purest of intentions, thinking, I'm not going to be corrupted by this, I'm just going to meet with these people, take their money, and use it for my campaign. Even if you think that, it's human nature to be impacted by your environment. 100% Joe Biden and Buttigieg have been impacted by meeting with wealthy donors. Joe Biden said it himself. Joe Biden, I think this is in 2008. I'll see if I can find the clip and cut it in here. He admitted this to himself, that if you meet with a wealthy donor, if you take money from a wealthy donor, that's obviously going to impact him.
Lobbyists aren't bad people. Special interest groups are not bad people. But guess what? They're corrosive. People who accept the money from them aren't bad people, but it's human nature. You go out, Lynn, and bundle $250,000 for me, all legal, and then you call me after I'm elected and say, Joe, I'd like to come and talk to you about something. You didn't buy me, but it's human nature. You helped me. I'm going to say, sure, Lynn, come on in.
So when you have a candidate admitting this, I mean, it tells you who they're working for. Now, compare that to, again, the Bernie Sanders strategy. For far too long, the wealthy and the powerful have used their money to buy our candidates and our elections, said Tim Tagaris, a senior advisor to Mr. Sanders. And what Bernie Sanders is proving for the first time is that one can run for president without begging them for their money. In a sign of the breadth of donors that Mr. Sanders counts, his campaign was pushing for 135,000 donations in the last 2 days of the year, while Mr. Biden here has set a goal of 500,000 donations for the entire quarter. So do you get that? Bernie Sanders pushing to get 135,000 donations in 2 days, whereas Joe Biden's goal was 500,000 for 3 months, the entire quarter. It really shows you how, different these two campaigns are. And honestly, I think a lot of voters know this. I think a lot of people that support Joe Biden know this. But they support Joe Biden because they think that he's the most electable one. And they think that because cable news is telling them that with no data, no information to back it up, no argument to back it up. Hillary Clinton is a moderate, ran on the same platform that Joe Biden's running on, of, reaching across the aisle, reaching to Republicans, bringing conservative voters over. Joe Biden's doing that just like Hillary Clinton did that. Hillary Clinton lost. And Hillary Clinton didn't lose because she didn't reach out enough to conservatives, to Republicans. Hillary Clinton lost because she suppressed the Democratic base. Young people didn't come out. Typical non-voters didn't come out. Independents didn't support her. That's where Bernie Sanders' strength is. Young voters, the Democratic base, typical non-voters, independents. I mean, as a lifelong independent himself, Bernie Sanders, he speaks to a lot of people that have been disillusioned by a two-party system. He will bring out a lot of people that have not voted in a while because they can see in Bernie Sanders someone who actually has, conviction, someone who's actually fought for the same thing for 40 years, has actually fought for people. Bernie Sanders is easily the most electable candidate in this race. And cable news is not making that argument because they benefit from the current system. These massive corporations, these wealthy news anchors on television, they're not going to make the argument for a grassroots candidate because it would negatively impact them. So, like, you have to understand where you're getting your information from. Me, as somebody who, I don't run a massive media conglomerate. I'm not making a ton of money off running CNN or MSNBC. I'm not benefiting from the status quo. I'm arguing for the average person. I care about the average person. That's what my motivation is. So you have to, and look, a lot of people that watch me know this stuff. Like, they understand that Bernie is the most electable candidate and that Joe Biden isn't. But this is why you have to tell your friends and family. You have to make this argument to the people in your lives. Make this argument to the Joe Biden supporters in your lives. Because again, I think a lot of them, they can tell Bernie Sanders is an honest guy. You can go back and watch his, clips of him from the early 90s, the 80s. He's fighting for the same thing. But they think, oh, but I want to beat Trump. Then ask them. How? So even if you beat Trump with Joe Biden, won't that just lead to another Trump-like figure 4 years later? Because weak Democrats that didn't actually fight for people, is what led to Donald Trump. So electing a Joe Biden is just going to put you back in the same situation that got you Donald Trump. I mean, how do people not see this? You need actual transformational change. You need to bring out especially the typical non-voter, especially young people. You bring those people out with the candidate that actually excites them in Bernie Sanders. You have to make this argument to the people in your lives because a lot of people are being misinformed by cable news.